Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening. Amen. This is a sermon about hope. We could all use some hope right now. I know I could. In his second letter to the Corinthian church, the Apostle Paul speaks of the hope of resurrection. He says God will raise us to be with God. He says even though our outer nature is wasting away, God is renewing us inwardly. And he says that we have an eternal home with God. This passage is often read at funerals or when we're particularly sitting with our belief about resurrection in the church. And that's good. I also think, though, that this passage holds some more immediate hope for us now, today, here. But before we get to that, we need to back up a little bit in that second letter to the Corinthians this morning. In the verses preceding today's reading, Paul describes the ministry to which he and we have been called. He then says this treasure, this good news of God's love for us and relationship with us, is something we carry around in an earthen jar. A treasure we carry around in a relatively non-durable, relatively fragile thing. Our son, Cyrus, is an archaeologist, and he's described dumps and middens that are just filled with these very common shards of broken pottery. And these aren't the beautiful pots you see in museums. These are daily use kinds of things, sometimes even produced, even anciently, on a mass scale. They are the disposables of the ancient world. And that's what we carry this treasure around in. Of course, Paul is using this metaphor to describe us. We are the clay pots, relatively fragile, non-durable. If this thing we carry, this life in God, this good news to the world, if this treasure we carry is so very precious and valuable, you would think God would have chosen to deposit it into something much safer, a spiritual Brinks truck for this treasure, a bomb-proof briefcase handcuffed to God's wrist, or at least some good solid Pyrex for crying out loud. Why is it set up this way? Why is this gift of God entrusted to we, fragile, fallible creatures? Paul says, it is so the power of it will be in God's hands, not in ours. So that God's action, breath, and creativity will be obvious, both to we whom God uses and to all who are watching us. The external is something that obviously is wasting or will waste away. The treasure of God's love and power is internal and eternal. So let's set that aside for a minute. The clay vessels and God's power, okay? Now to today's passage. In it, Paul says that the one who raised Jesus from the dead will raise us up too. He says, don't lose heart. Though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed on a daily basis. He reminds us not to look at what can be seen, those things are temporary, but instead to look at what cannot be seen, a paradox indeed, pointing to things that are eternal. Even if every structure we call shelter, home, safety is destroyed, we have something much safer and something much stronger. We have a home with God, even now. Every goal we set and every action we take, if we're honest, boils down to this. We all want someone to love us. We all want approval and control. We all want to be safe. And we want all those things for the people we love. Nothing wrong with wanting those things at all. But we often seek them out in ways that are problematic or become problematic. We often look to and rely on those outer nature things, those temporary things, to tell us that we're loved and good enough and safe. And then they waste away, and we are left with nothing. Income, partners, achievements at school or work, health and strength, influence, they all waste away eventually. And the fear of that eventuality drives us to double down on keeping those external things, grasping them even more tightly. Now, I said this was a sermon about hope, didn't I? The good news is there is hope. Often when we think of hope or express hope, we really mean something that we wish. I hope you have a good day. I hope to get the job. I hope my test scores are high. Wishes are often very specific. Sometimes when we think about hope, we think about staying optimistic. Optimists didn't survive very long in the POW camps of Vietnam. The optimists would say things like, we'll be out by Christmas, or we'll be out by spring. And with each marker that passed, without their release, the optimist's will to live decreased. I read someplace this week that an optimist is only 3 disappointments away from becoming a cynic. So, clearly, optimism and wishes aren't going to get us there. Hope is neither of these. Hope looks with eyes wide open on the full and sometimes catastrophic reality of our situation, accepts that reality, and then sees beyond it to what will be as God moves and creates and breathes in that circumstance. Hope lets us experience God renewing our inner nature, even as all those external things are passing away, even as the pots break. Often we can't see meaning in what's happening at any particular time in our life, especially in those difficult chapters, until we are far past them in time. Only then, perhaps with the 2020 that hindsight gives us, are we able to make meaning out of our struggle. Hope is the thing that allows us to appropriate that distant peace and meaning, even as we are experiencing the struggle. Hope is the thing that allows us to see so far into the future that we experience the grace of God in the present moment. In yet another paradox of our faith, having hope requires that we are broken, requires that we're carrying around the good news of God's love in breakable clay jars. The cost of living a life of hope is sometimes exceedingly high. So this is nothing to trivialize. This is no time to give ourselves or others some pat answer that God is doing something good, so you should be grateful, or any other toxic kind of religious platitude. Living our faith, carrying everything in these fragile vessels is not to be dismissed. But without that fragility, without that intimate and constant understanding that the jar is already broken, the loss is already upon us. Without that, we have no need for hope and no access to it. A hopeless person, paradoxically again, has all their treasures stored up safely, so it would appear. That hopeless person is carrying all their treasures in a strong box, has stored it all in a fireproof safe. No need to look past the present for God's action in their life and in the world. All is good right now. All is safe. All is under control. Or so we tell ourselves. If we wish to live lives of hope, if we want to be a community that gives hope to the world, we first have to look eyes wide open, and see those realities around us that are not as they should be, not as God would have them, not just or whole or well. Only in those broken places, those fragile places, can we carry this treasure, the good news of God's love for us and of God's action and creativity in the catastrophe. It is in those places, as the outer nature is wasting away, decaying, that we can have a vision of the internal nature being renewed. It is in these places that renewal, resurrection, and our home in God now can be inhabited. So, if you are hopeless right now, I invite you to hope. I invite you to the fragility and impermanence of everything. I invite you into this community, which will stand with you in hope, looking so far into the future together that we experience God's grace in the present moment. There is hope.